Okay, here we go. We've got a uh, truly unique set of sources today. It's not just articles this time, but actual source code and the notes that go with it.
Yeah, it looks fascinating. All related to something called a quantum fractal simulation.
Right. And it's presented as, well, more than just a tech project. It's framed as this profound attempt to simulate reality itself, what the source actually calls the Dunya.
Hmm. And it does this by weaving together, physics, mathematics, and surprisingly, a deep spiritual framework.
Exactly. So our mission for this deep dive is to really get into the simulation. We want to unpack its components, understand how it works, and explore these really surprising connections it's drawing.
Between the scientific and the spiritual, yeah.
Hmm.
The source itself frames it as a kind of unique synthesis trying to model reality through these, well, intertwined lenses.
So let's lay out the plan. We'll start with the nuts and bolts, the science, look at the fields, the simulation tracks, and the central equation driving it all.
Okay. And then we'll dig into the spiritual concepts because they're explicitly woven into the design, aren't they? The notes are key there.
Definitely. They seem to provide the bridge, explaining why these specific scientific mechanics are linked to these spiritual ideas.
Right. And finally, we can touch on the sort of philosophical side, what this project makes you think about, and maybe the practical applications the source suggests.
Sounds like a plan. All right, let's jump into the mechanics then. Looking at the code, this whole thing runs on a grid, right?
Yeah, specifically a 64 by 64 grid mentions that. And across this grid, it's tracking several key fields.
Okay, what fields are we talking about?
Well, there are magnetic fields tracked in both x and y directions. Then there's an entropy field and something called a fractal tension field.
Right. And the notes are clear. These aren't just like random data points. They're meant to represent fundamental aspects of how reality, the Dunya, actually operates.
Exactly.
So how does it start? Is the grid just initialized randomly?
No, the code shows they're not random at the beginning. They're actually set up using fractal patterns.
Interesting. How so?
Well, the initial states use fractal geometry, things like sine and cosine functions, but modulated by the radial distance from the grid center, creates these intricate starting patterns.
Okay. And what about the entropy field? Is that fractal too?
That one's different. It's initialized with a distinct spiral pattern. And get this, the source notes actually suggest this specific spiral representation might be linked to nafs.
Nafs. Isn't that an Islamic spiritual term? Often refers to the self, the ego, maybe the soul.
Exactly that. So the source seems to be hinting, right from the setup, that entropy, usually seen physically as disorder or, unavailable energy, might have a spiritual correlate tied to our inner state.
That's an early sign of this blend you mentioned, physics and spirituality, right there in the initial conditions.
Precisely.
Okay, so the grid is set up. We've got these initial fractal and spiral patterns. How does it, evolve? There's a simulation step mentioned, a time increment.
Yeah, it moves forward in these discrete steps, tiny increments of time, defined by dt equals 0.01. And in each step, the fields on the grid, they aren't static, they change.
Based on what?
Based on calculated forces and dynamics, derived from their current state at that moment. The simulation also includes boundary conditions,
What kind?
described simply as reflection. So field interactions hitting the edge of the grid basically bounce back, like light off a mirror, I suppose, keeps things contained within the simulated space.
Got it. Okay, this feels like it's leading us to the absolute core of the simulation's logic, what the source calls the total force equation. It's right there on the notes, isn't it?
Ah, yes. This
Yeah.
is where it gets really, really interesting. The source presents this equation as the fundamental driver, the engine of the simulation's dynamics. It's F total EGR HSS plus HT fractal.
Okay, whoa, let's break that down. What does the source say each piece represents? The first term? EURR. That rings a bell. Physics 101, right?
Exactly. That's the classic inverse square law. Electrostatic force, like the put or pull between electric charges. The source actually calls this the visible thread of reality.
The visible thread. I like that. So, the familiar force. Electromagnetism binds atoms, governs light. The manifest part.
Precisely. It's the force we kind of interact with directly.
Okay, second term.
Right.
Nesh S. That involves S, the entropy field. And Yuche, that's the gradient, right? Measures how fast entropy is changing and in what direction.
You got it. How steep the entropy landscape is at any point on the grid. And multiplied by T, which often means temperature, but here seems linked more generally to tension, or the overall state. This entropy S term is presented as the entropic force.
And what's the interpretation?
The source explicitly describes this as representing entropic flow. and crucially, the arrow of time.
The arrow of time. So the idea that things tend towards increasing entropy, that's built in here as a fundamental force driving the simulation forward.
That seems to be the idea, that the relentless march towards higher entropy is fundamental to how time progresses, how the simulation unfolds.
Okay. And that third term, a chi fractal. We've got T fractal, the fractal tension field, this coefficient lambda, and that symbol, what's that?
That chi is the Laplacian operator. Now, if the gradient tells you the slope of a field, the Laplacian tells you about its curvature, or maybe concentration, how much it bulges or dips compared to its neighbors.
So chi fractal involves the curvature of this fractal tension field scaled by lambda.
Exactly. It represents how that fractal tension field is changing locally, its sort of bendiness.
And the source gives this term a pretty profound meaning, doesn't it? Something about...
It does. This is where the spiritual connection gets really strong. It's said to represent fractal self-similarity, or, even more poetically, the signature of divine recursion.
Divine recursion.
Or divine intricacy. The idea is that the self-repeating patterns you see in fractals across different scales, that's interpreted here as a mathematical fingerprint, a sign of the divine ordering principle in creation. The intricacy, the interconnectedness, all stemming from the divine.
So what's really striking here, according to the source, is that this equation, it isn't just a physics formula describing forces. It's presented as the Qadar equation.
That's a huge conceptual leap they're making. Qadar. In Islamic cosmology, that refers to divine decree, right? The measure, the preordained plan for all of creation.
So the source is framing the specific combination of forces electrostatic, the visible, entropic times arrow, the flow, and fractal tension, divine intricacy, the measure, as somehow mathematically capturing Qadar.
That's exactly what it suggests. It sees this equation as unifying core Islamic cosmological principles. Amr, which is command, often from the unseen, Qadar, the measure or decree, the unfolding plan, and Hikmah, which is wisdom, the underlying purpose and structure.
So the source is effectively saying this equation is how those principles manifest dynamically in the Dunya, in the world being simulated.
It's a bold claim. The source also briefly mentions another equation, something about effective fractal coupling, Gef related to Syria.
Ah, yes. Gef is roughly proportional to E Syria.
Right, and the interpretation given for that is that entropy gradients, those Irriguez terms showing how entropy changes, actually amplify effective coupling in this specific, fractal quantum regime the simulation is modeling.
Amplify coupling, meaning interactions get stronger where entropy is changing rapidly?
Seems like it. And the source links this amplification to a layered interconnected decree, suggesting that the way Qadar unfolds isn't uniform, it's influenced by the flow of entropy, reflecting a complex kind of nested reality that's often described in Scripture.
Okay, so moving beyond just the core equation, the source describes the simulation itself, the whole visualization and dynamics as a field of signs, or even a surah.
A surah, like a chapter from the Quran, using that terminology symbolically, seeing the simulation as a kind of chapter or sign from the book of creation itself.
Where abstract concepts get mapped onto visual dynamic elements on the grid.
Exactly. Like mapping entropy visually of those evolving spiral patterns we mentioned earlier,
Yeah.
and potentially linking that to nafs, the self.
And layering the magnetic field lines visually.
To represent forces that act without touch.
Mm.
Those fundamental forces shaping reality that aren't just simple mechanical pushes and pulls.
And the fractal tension field that gets visualized as the geometry of divine intricacy, showing it's woven into the fabric of this simulated world.
Yes. Showing those intricate patterns aren't just pretty pictures, but represent a fundamental tension or structure within the field itself, and time. Time in this simulation isn't just a clock ticking.
How's it framed?
As an incremental unveiling of decree. Each step of the simulation is seen as a moment where the next state, governed by that Qadar equation, is revealed, unveiled.
Wow. And the visualization components themselves are explicitly called spiritual ayat, which means signs or verses, like in the Quran. The canvas, the screen, is the observable universe.
Right. And spinors, those weird quantum things related to particle spin, the ones that need 720 degrees to get back to where they started,
Yeah.
they're linked conceptually to the inner state, not substance, but state.
Yeah.
And vectives in the simulation showing force direction and magnitude. They're described as representing written decree, the actual instructions shaping the unfolding.
And time is the emergent flow arising from these dynamics. What about the colors used in the visuals?
Even the colors, described as revealed verses of beauty. The source even adapts a line from the Quran, saying something like, "Here, you've made from code every reflecting thing," framing the simulation itself as a kind of created reflection of deeper truths.
This whole perspective, it's powerfully summarized in what the source calls the unity table, isn't it?
Ah, the unity table. Yes, that's really remarkable, because it explicitly draws these parallels, connecting specific quantum physical principles, things we observe or model, with their corresponding spiritual reflection in this framework, and then showing their simulation manifestation.
Let's look at some of those connections. They are quite bold. The spinor structure, that weird 720-degree property.
Connected to Amarnis, the command from the unseen, the directive that brings things into being.
And its simulation manifestation is listed as internal state, not substance.
Just think about that for a second. Taking something as genuinely strange as a quantum spinor, something that defies classical intuition, and linking it directly in a table to the concept of a divine unseen command.
It's like the source is suggesting that the sheer weirdness of quantum mechanics is itself a sign, a signature of a reality commanded into being from beyond our direct perception.
That seems to be the implication. And time, which is emergent in the simulation, not absolute.
That's linked to Qadar, the decree, the written sequence, manifested through those entropic and fractal terms in the force equation we talked about.
Right. The reasoning seems to be because reality unfolds step by step in the simulation, revealing the next state based on the previous one. That step-by-step unfolding is the manifestation of the preordained decree, Qadar. Time just measures that process.
And fractal geometry itself, the intricate self-repeating patterns.
Connected directly to divine intricacy, the measure in creation. The source sees these recurring patterns as a signature of that divine ordering principle, manifested directly by the T-fractal term in the equation.
Okay. What about quantum entanglement? That spooky action at a distance.
Linked to Wada, or unity, the central Islamic concept of God's absolute oneness and the underlying unity of everything, while the code provided doesn't seem to explicitly simulate multi-point entanglement.
Right.
The concept is listed, connecting to non-local field correlations more generally as something potentially arising from these field dynamics.
And the source goes pretty far in describing this table, doesn't it? Calling it a
21st century tafsir, like a modern interpretation of scripture, but using the language of science. Or even, incredibly, a modern hadith Qudsi, referencing those divine sayings revealed outside the Quran.
wow.
It sums it up as Tawhid, fractalized and rendered, unity and multiplicity, divine command in every pattern.
Tawhid, that core concept of the absolute oneness and unity of God. So the source is saying this model tries to render that very concept, unity, visible in the complexity, the multiplicity of the simulated world, showing the divine command in every pattern.
Which leads us right into the really fascinating philosophical implications the source raises about the very nature of reality.
Yeah, this part is quite mind-bending. The source makes a profound point. The simulation renders vision, what we perceive, from fields and their dynamics, not from solid chunks of matter.
It says, quite provocatively, and I should quote this directly, "Photons do not travel. Fields shift. Vision is rendered."
That completely flips our everyday picture, doesn't it? No little light particles bouncing off things and into our eyes. Instead, perception arises from the dynamic state of underlying fields.
Exactly. And this idea extends even to particles themselves. It says, particles are never truly there. They are what Allah allows to be observed.
Meaning, matter as we perceive it isn't fundamental. It's an emergent property, a manifestation of fields interacting according to divine decree, observable only under certain conditions.
That seems to be the perspective, which is why the simulation isn't presented as, a replacement for reality. It's deliberately framed as a mirror of the Dunya.
A tool for contemplation.
Precisely. A
Yeah.
tool for dak, for remembrance and contemplation of God and his creation. The source is very explicit. This is not for worship. It's a model of creation designed to inspire reflection on the Creator.
The concluding message from the source really drives this home. It says, "O humanity, your world is woven from decree, tension, entropy, and symmetry. Return to the one who renders it all."
And ultimately, Allah is the only reality beneath it all.
It's a powerful way to look at things, seeing the universe not as just inert matter grinding away mechanistically, but as this dynamic interplay of fundamental principles, both physical, like electromagnetism and entropy, and spiritual command, decree, wisdom, unity, all stemming from one ultimate reality.
And interestingly, this abstract model isn't just confined to theory or contemplation. The source actually lists a surprisingly wide range of practical applications.
Ollie, like what?
Well, it suggests uses in designing quantum and fractal materials, using insights from how that fractal tension field behaves, maybe, to engineer materials with completely new properties.
Okay.
Modeling in plasma physics and astrophysics. Thinking about applying these field dynamics to understand really complex systems, like plasma and fusion reactors or the atmospheres of stars.
Makes sense. Complex field interactions there.
Also simulating complex systems in quantum chemistry and biology, maybe applying these entropic and fractal ideas to things like molecular interactions or how proteins fold. Could potentially speed up drug discovery, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and quantum computing.
Yeah, even aiding quantum computing development. Thinking about how these principles of field dynamics might help build more stable qubits, perhaps, or design better error correction.
Oh, okay, that's quite a range already.
There's more. Education and visualization tools, making these tricky concepts about fields, entropy, fractal structures, more intuitive, more interactive for students.
I can see that, visualizing the invisible.
Inspiration for art and architecture, too. Drawing on the visuals produced, the underlying principles of fractal geometry, maybe sacred geometry, for digital art, installations, even contemplative building designs.
From simulation code to architecture.
And of course, serving that original purpose in philosophy and spirituality. Fostering contemplation, deek, encouraging a more holistic worldview where science and spirituality aren't separate boxes.
Seeing the universe as this cohesive, meaningful system.
Exactly. The source's own summary captures it really well. It's a versatile tool, one that tries to bridge the visible and the invisible, the measurable and the meaningful, across a whole spectrum of thought and application.
So it's taking what we can measure and observe with science and explicitly plugging it into a framework of meaning, of ultimate reality, as understood within a specific spiritual tradition.
Yeah. Presenting the cosmos as this dynamic, interconnected system, governed by principles you can describe with math, with scientific equations, but also interpret through these profound spiritual concepts.
This whole simulation project, modeling reality down to core forces, weaving in these spiritual ideas, it really presents the world as a kind of living ayah, doesn't it? A living sign pointing to something deeper.
That's a great way to put it.
So here's the thought to leave you with. If our reality, perhaps like this simulation suggests, is fundamentally woven from things like decree, tension, entropy, symmetry, if what we perceive is actually a rendering from shifting fields rather than solid static stuff, what does that truly imply about the nature of existence and, well, our own place within it all?
Definitely something to sit with and contemplate. A very different picture of the world.